So I was just saying it's a work hard, play hard conference. So thank you for sticking with it. My name's Elaine Hale. I'm a senior research engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And when I started at NREL, I was in the Commercial Buildings Research Group during building energy analysis. About 10 years ago, I discovered the grid. And ever since, I've just been watching all sorts of people discover each other. So all of the different sectors have been discovering the grid. The grid has been discovering all of the other sectors. It's really at a very exciting time. We started about 10 years ago looking at the value of demand response to the bulk power system. And just to think about where we are today, where we're trying to decarbonize all of the different sectors, and the electricity system is so central to all of that, and just how much integration we're trying to do. It's just unbelievable and really fun to watch. I hope you agree with me that it's kind of fun to be involved in this and see what's going on. And I'm excited about our panelists this morning. So we have kind of a super long session. It's just all morning, but we'll have a coffee break in the middle. So it's really like 2 sessions. And in the first half, we are going to hear 4 talks from industry about what they're planning for, what their future scenarios look like. And I think they're, all looking at a very dynamic demand side. So we'll get to hear about that. And then after the coffee break, we'll go to methods for long-term load forecasting in this dynamic environment. So that's kind of how the session is organized. And kind of coming back to where we are for this first half, I think we can all look out for the themes that we've been hearing all week. I think we're going to see some decarbonization endpoints and some uncertainty about when we're actually going to reach those decarbonization endpoints, like Ryan was talking about yesterday. And we're definitely going to hear about transportation electrification. We're going to see some mixed or unclear outlooks for heating electrification. And we're going to see some large loads like data centers and hydrogen. I'm sure some other themes that we've been hearing this week will come up as well. But let's dive right in. So our first talk is from Laurent DuBus from RTE. And I'll let Laurent get set up and take it away.
Well, good morning, Elaine. Good morning, everyone. You should be able to see my slides in full screen now. Can you just confirm, please? Okay. So thank you for the invitation to attend this final session. I must say that my field of expertise is not really load forecasting, but I'm working with colleagues who are more expert than me, and then I will try to give you quite a broad overview of what we do at RTE. For those who don't know us, RTE is the French TSO. It's the only one in France because we have the monopoly for that. And so we are also part of the NSOE, the European Network for Transmission System Operators. So the outline of my talk will be quite simple. I will talk briefly about our current prospective studies. One has been published last year, and one is going to be published later this year or early 2024. I will describe shortly the midterm scenarios which are under consideration in those prospective exercises. And then I will just present a few R&D activities related to load forecasting, both with talking about our strengths, because we have some strengths we think, but also about many questions we have and activities that are more difficult to achieve because of the changing landscape. And then I will summarize. So prospective studies, what do I talk about? So we, of course, in the context of the energy transition, the fight against climate change and so on, we need to have as robust as possible prospective studies on the midterm and the long term. For that, RTE published in 2021 a very extensive study called Energy Pathways to 2050. You can find the executive summary of that study on our website. Unfortunately, the full report is not available in English. Maybe it's lucky you because it's more than 1,000 pages. So basically, this study looked at different energy mix scenarios to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And together with our National Agency for Energy Transition, ADEME, those scenarios are the basis for the preparation of the new French energy climate strategy that will be published likely in the middle of next year. So in this study, I will briefly describe it just after, but basically it looked at 2050, and we also have some compulsory and regulatory publications that we need to do every 2 years, looking forward to the next 15 years. This is called Bilan Prévisionnel in 2023, and yeah, in English it would be something like a midterm adequacy report. So it needs to do some updates on a regular basis. You're still fulfilling the long-term targets to 2050, but it needs to be revised because of the evolving things, I would say, all over the world and in France and in Europe. So first of all, we have the new EU climate ambitions, with the latest version being called Fit for 55, which has increased the targets for renewable energy generation and decarbonation by 2030. Due to the recent crisis, so both the COVID situation, but also the war in Ukraine, the gas crisis, and so on, the new strategy of France is targeting towards more energy independence and reindustrialization of our country. Of course, we need to also take into account the latest geopolitical changes with the tensions on, for instance, on fuels supply, on raw materials, and so on. And also we have some revised technical assumptions, for instance, about biomass. So what are those midterm scenarios? So first of all, for the Energy Pathway to 2050 report, we considered 3 main scenarios for load, for demand, with a baseline consisting of gradual electrification and an ambitious energy efficiency plan. It assumes continued economic and demographic growth, and basically the level of demand in that scenario was around 650 terawatt-hours in 2050. For your reference, the current load is around, the current consumption in France is around 480 terawatt-hours. So it's a significant increase. And in addition to that baseline scenario, we had 2 other ones, a larger one and a smaller one. So the sufficiency targeted lifestyle changes to increase especially energy efficiency in terms of end use and consumption, and resulting in an overall reduction in energy needs and energy consumption. So it was more or less 100 terawatt-hours less. But we also looked at a sharp rebound of manufacturing industry share with the reindustrialization, without going back to the levels of the early 1990s, which were higher. And in that one, it's more than 100 terawatt-hours more than the baseline scenario. So the study mixed all those scenarios with demand scenarios, with generation scenarios as well. And so they are still valid, but now we want to look more closely at the 2030, 2035 horizon. And so in that situation, we developed 3 new scenarios. So scenario A, which is more or less again baseline, or at least the perspective we want to reach, assumes that we will have a successful acceleration, meaning that it's an achievement of the Fit for 25 objectives from the European Union. And so in that scenario, we want to detail the electrical system that we need to achieve the objectives of the authorities. But we also do some risk analysis exercise with scenarios B and C, which on the one side, so scenario B is only a partial impairment. Basically, it means that we would be a few years late with respect to the national and European objectives. And the idea is to establish what the electrical system would look like in a scenario where those objectives are not met. And scenario C is about thwarted globalization, so basically an adverse global context. And in that one, we want to study the effects and possible adaptation of the decarbonization strategies that would be needed in the degraded global context. And so the idea of those risk analysis exercises are to examine what will be the consequences of not achieving the objectives in terms of CO2 emissions, but also in terms of cost, security of supply, resilience of the system, and so on. So the different trajectories are the following. So what you can see with the orange line on the left is the historical evolution of the consumption. You can see a drop in 2020 due to the COVID crisis, and another one in 2022. So the last point of the historical observations due to the crisis we had in Europe last year, especially due to the prices of electricity. And then you have the projections for all the different scenarios. So all the scenarios are not a single trajectory, but an ensemble of trajectories. Of course, scenario A is the highest in terms of load, and then the two ones are smaller. And so we have in the end contrasting consumption trajectories, which are part of this assessment forecast for 2023. In the baseline scenario, there is really a growing prospect of increased consumption, and it is especially important in 4 sector and uses, which are concerned by really major changes. So the first one is transportation, because in this scenario, we assume that the development of electric mobility will be quite important, with several millions, of, even several dozens of millions of electric cars, but also for EV mobility. So this is mainly by e-fuels and electricity. We also base this scenario on a large development of data centers. So, which means digital related consumption. We already have a lot of requests for data centers to be developed in France. Regarding residential and tertiary heating, we do not see major changes. There will be an increase in cooling needs and decrease in heating needs related to the evolution of temperature due to climate change. But overall, the annual change of this is not extremely important. There's more or less a balance between the increase and the decrease in winter and summer, respectively. And the last fourth sector is the industrial use of energy, with both large increase in industrial processes consumption due to the reindustrialization of France, but also the needs for hydrogen. And so all those aspects mean that there will be a necessary transformation and necessary transformations, plural, on the industrial and daily life plan. So this is for the general scope, and I would like now just to show you what we do at the R&D level. First of all, we have I told about pride, humility, and certainty. So first of all, the thing we are proud of is the power consumption predictions, which basically is the historical expertise of R&D at RTE. So we have methodologies. I think it's not revolutionary. I think everyone does the same thing, but it's something that works quite well, and we are pretty happy with the results we get. So basically, we have different sources of data, and the idea is to use panels of consumers and load metering to reconstruct profiles of consumption for different uses. So I can mention, for instance, that we have a residential panel called Elecdom, so the first top one. So in that case, we have now 2 or 3 years of data in which we equipped 100 households with individual power plugs. So we have, I think, something like 25 individual sensors in every household, with a time tape of it's not even 10 minutes. I think it's 1 minute, so that we can monitor extremely accurately the uses per device for cooking, for charging phones, for internet boxes, and so on. And it's very useful because it allows us to update the daily profiles of energy consumption from households, because the previous profiles were already outdated. They were established, I think, in the early 2000s. So at a time where people didn't have many smartphones or several computers or several TVs at home. And so the profiles have really changed since then. From the tertiary buildings side, we are currently developing another panel called Electrification. And the idea is to create, again, a representative sample of tertiary consumers. So this is a work in progress. For the industries and large consumers, we extract data which are measured specifically there in a general way. So for instance, we have the very accurate measurements for SNCF, which is the French railway company. For the large tertiary sites, so we have accurate monitoring, so that's very good. And for transportation, so from electric vehicles, we have also displacement profiling, because we developed a tool called Move the LTL, which is basically an electric vehicle consumption or injection on the network that has been developed in the last few years. So for instance, just here on the left plot at the bottom, you have an example of the cooking load of one household. So you can see that we are very accurate and high resolution measures. And on the left side, you have the industrial load of one specific site, where you can see, for instance, in January 2020, there was a stop in the consumption. So basically due to a decrease in activity. So we have very accurate data of this kind, which is very precious to build those demand profiles in terms of power. So from this, we can then decompose the load curve to increase representativeness. And what we do in general is that we separate the different components from a time perspective. So we have weekly, daily, and hourly coefficients from which we can then reconstruct the load for all the profiles, and it works really well, as it can be seen here. So for instance, it's the new profiles at normal temperature. I don't remember, but no, it's the overall profile for France. So you can see that the overall consumption is around 80 gigawatts in winter. And so if we compare predictions versus observations, if you look just at the right bottom plot, you can see that the average prediction error is close to zero, with more or less plus or minus 2 or 3 gigawatts of error based on maximum value of 80 gigawatts. So it's pretty good. And overall, the mean error is around 1 or 1.5%, which is very acceptable. No, we talked about pride. Let's talk about humility now. And of course, as you all know, the art of prediction is very difficult, but dreams are allowed. I won't go into the details here, but there are some predictions which were made in the past about New York dunk forecast, for instance, about neo-Malthusianism, post-apocalyptic, or the future of internet. If we just talk about the last one, there was a guy who was very famous at that time, who predicted that internet had no future because it was not able to handle bank transfers, for instance. And he said that I don't know if some of you know the Minitel, which was a revolutionary French invention in the 1980s, which in practice disappeared and left the place to internet. So prediction is a difficult art, and we need to be to keep some humility when we do forecasts. So how to predict the future? You can have different tools, or you can trust your good chance. But basically, when it comes to load, I guess all of you in the room do more or less the same thing, but you have different approaches depending on the time frame, on the time horizon. So from the short term, where you can extrapolate things under unchanged consumption structure and modeling weather variability and hazard and so on. And the more you look into the future, the more the forecasts become predictions or projections, prospective rather than really forecast. The uncertainty increases, and of course you cannot be as accurate in the future as you can be in the next days or in the next months. What we try to do is to make an analytical representation of demand. So the consumption of a use or a branch is a mix between the volume indicator, which is, for instance, for residential consumption, it would be the number of equipped households. Then you just multiply by the intensity of the indicator. It would be unit consumption for the residential use. And you need also, of course, to integrate socioeconomic, technological, behavioral, regulatory changes, and so on. You need also to take into account sector and total demands, which are calculated by aggregation. So basically, it's a bottom-up approach. And this kind of modeling is particularly suited to medium and long-term analysis. So that's basically the approach we take for long-term forecasting. And of course, you also need to take into account projections or scenarios in terms of energy efficiency related to the formal renovation of households or industries, the technical progress with for instance, the increase in the efficiency ratio of heat pumps and things like that. You need also to consider assumptions about the what we call the volume effect, which is related to the evolution of demography, the evolution of economy through GDP, for instance, the level and the rate of electrification of the uses, and also some sobriety measures by which consumers would become more sober in terms of energy consumption, like we had this winter, because you may know that in Europe and in France in particular, we had a difficult situation this winter, and we strongly encourage consumers to reduce their consumption, and it worked quite well because we estimate that there was a 10% reduction in consumption linked to sobriety. Now, if we want to be lucid, we have a very, very important need in our case, which is to localize the future load, especially when it comes to the perspective about the development of the network itself. Because the network, you all know how it works, and if all the consumption is localized in a single region or a few regions, then from a network operating system point of view, it can be very difficult. So one of the strong issues we have, and what we are working on very hard at the moment, is to really localize the future industrial location of the future industrial load. Sorry. So we have really a prospect for an increasing electricity consumption, which shall not. So we have many requests for connection to the system by customers. Not all of them are absolutely relevant, so we need to also understand how it works and so on. You can consider, for instance, that some consumers do for some requests for network connection in different sites, depending on their different options based to the price of the terrain and so on. And so we need to carefully analyze all that to make our best estimate of where the consumption should be developed. And so we have a new strategy for 4 major industrial port zone, in which we want to encourage customers to install their new facilities, because it would be easier from a network development perspective. Last but not least, in the end, we get a huge amount of data to proceed. So both internal data and external data. So for the internal data, of course, we have all the panels I mentioned, but many other sources from various entities, from various directions into the company. So it's a lot of data and heterogeneous data to handle, which is not easy. We also have the external data, so for instance, consumption data coming from various sources, all the panels we have. And we also need to take into account data from neighboring countries, for instance. And we can also have more qualitative data from what we can call interviews with chambers of commerce and territorial actors, so regions, counties, and so on. We also try to get information from industrial federation, especially for large industries, and the development agencies and manufacturers as well. So it's really a huge amount of various and diverse data to handle. And what we aim to do at the end is to create a parametric downscaling method, which would be applicable to our network studies. If I'm coming to my summary, because I think my time is over, so I would just like to emphasize that long-term perspective starts with those forecasts, of course, rather load scenarios, because we can't really speak of forecast at several years or even 10 or 15 years ahead. The second point is that electrification of fossil fuels or fossil uses will really be a game changer. It's necessary to fight against climate change, but it will be really a game changer. And so the complexity of load forecasting is increasing compared to what we knew in the past. The fourth point is that really data access, collection, and capitalization is really key. We need data to improve our load forecasting tools. And also, of course, we need to not forget that climate change needs to be taken into consideration. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Laurent. That was a great presentation. And we're going to save questions to the end, like we've been doing all conference. So now I'd like to encourage Laurent to stay around. We will have questions at the end of all the talks. And now Sagar Depala from National Grid ESO is also going to join us virtually. And we see your screen, so that's great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, and we can hear you.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Oh, and you're not quite in presenter mode yet on your slides.
Am I now?
No, we're seeing PowerPoint.
Oh, then we've got a delay. Hold on. It says I'm sharing.
Yeah, I wonder if you need to switch screens or.
I can see what's on your screen, and it's different to what's on my screen, and I don't have presenter view turned on either. Elaine, I can assure you, Elaine made sure she checked all of this with us just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, we see all your thumbnails still. We don't just see the one screen, the one slide.
Okay, let's try again.
There we go. Great.
Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. Take it
Great.
away.
Okay. I hope I didn't give away any punchlines or anything. Yeah. Good morning. And thanks for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be sharing here. So this is who I am. I'm Sagar. I work in a team within the electricity system operator. We're part of National Grid, and similar to Laurent's situation, we're the transmission system operator for Great Britain. And one of our secret ingredients to what we're able to do is the level of stakeholder engagement that we've got, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that as I go on. You're obviously not 5, but you've had a long conference, so I'm going to try and get to some points quickly. So these are the people that matter, right? So it's the end consumers, it's businesses, it's industry, it's me, you. We need energy when we need it. But the way we get that is going to change, and the way we move it around is going to change as well. So we need to think of different versions of the future, and to do that, we need to start off with some really good research. So here's who we are. We use research and stakeholder engagement to create scenarios, and decarbonisation is central to what we're doing. So these scenarios are about getting to net zero by 2050 for Great Britain, but also decarbonising the power sector by 2035 for us. And that has to be in a way that's reliable, fair, affordable, and secure for everybody. Here are my main messages, really similar to what Laurent's team does. We publish bottom-up scenarios for Great Britain. I'll talk to you a little bit about how we build our scenario framework. Unsurprisingly, electricity demand increases in all scenarios, but I'll talk a little bit about how we can harness flexibility to smooth out peaks, and how our forecasting for flexibility and our long-term load forecasting work together. I'll talk a little bit about how a stressed system changes. So one of the reasons we forecast demand, obviously, is to design, a network that can handle it. That stress currently happens on a cold, dark day when our peak demand is highest. But tomorrow's system works in a different way. We have, as we have more wind and solar on the system, we don't decide when we have electricity generation so much. So stress for the system is going to be defined by low supply, high demand, and it's that difference between supply and demand that's going to matter, and we manage that through flexibility. And I'll talk a little bit about lot about what we know already. I'll try and share some of our insights, and I'll talk about what we don't know, which essentially the biggest areas of uncertainty, which Elaine mentioned in her introduction. We've got decarbonisation of heat. We're as uncertain here as you are there, and what we do about industrial flexibility. Real big uncertainty about those. So my main messages. Our publication is called FES, Future Energy Scenarios. We're about to launch in July, and these are not probabilistic scenarios, but we use them to represent the edges of uncertainty. So these are quite extreme scenarios. We have two axes really. Vertical axis, how much progress we make towards decarbonisation and how quickly we do it, and then we have a split between we try and stretch the range of credibility for who has to change more, whether that's the consumer changing and changing their behaviour, changing their technology, or whether it's the system changing. So on this axis, if you kind of have the consumer changing not that much and the system not changing a lot, we see the slowest credible progress in a scenario towards decarbonisation. That's a scenario called falling short. We then have two scenarios that do meet net zero by 2050 across the whole economy. But in one scenario, we look at the extreme of how consumers can change. And that happens mainly through lots of engagement in flexibility and lots of electrification of demand, particularly heat. The system transformation scenario is one where consumers, by and large, can interact with the energy system how they do today, but the system needs to change to decarbonise, and that's where we see hydrogen as a medium, as a vector, become a lot more prominent. And when you balance those two in our modelling, so high consumer engagement and smart thinking about all aspects of the energy system, we get this most progressive scenario called leading the way. And we're not saying any of these particular scenarios are most likely or less likely. Really, we expect reality to fall in this sort of grey shaded area. And that's how the scenarios are plotted on on our actual matrix. So we keep this sort of grey line, this falling short scenario, as a counterfactual to let people know, look, we really know we can get a net zero economy by 2050, but we may fall short, we may not get there. We showed 3 ways to get there, and one way that we could get there as early as 2046 as well. This line shows carbon emissions for Great Britain by year, starting in 2020. At the sort of left-hand extreme of this graph, we're at about 500 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. In 1990, that was 800. So between 1990 and now, we've almost halved our emissions, and we're proud of that. We're one of the fastest decarbonising economies in the world in Britain, but we're also careful not to become complacent, because all the things that got us here, all the good things that got us here, won't get us to where we need to be by 2050. And here's what energy flow looks like today. So there's about 1,600 terawatt hours of energy demand ultimately, and it comes from these 3 main areas. I'm going to use blue for natural gas, yellow for electricity, and grey for other. And we're able to look at different scenarios and through sort of a close understanding of sources of demand on the right hand side, and then where it's going to come from, we can start to understand how energy flows every year between now and 2050. The scenarios themselves are used in this country for network planning, deciding what assets and infrastructure we need on the ground, what market mechanisms we need, and what policy we need as well. So we launch every year, and in that annual cycle, we're working very closely with the government and a lot of stakeholders through the industry. Right now, we're part of a private company. We are going to be owned by the government in about a year's time. We're going to our name is not decided yet, but we're going to go into government ownership, and we're going to be an arm of the public sector, essentially, providing formal advice to the government over the next 12 months. That's something we're thinking about and getting ready for. A lot of the data I'm sharing with you is from our last publication, which, because of how timings fall, is almost a year old. So if you're interested in learning more and seeing our most up-to-date numbers, we're launching 13th and 14th of July. It's a virtual event, and specifically, we're going to be talking about energy consumer on the 14th of July. But we're going to talk about all these subjects here, and there's a link at the bottom for where to register. If you just search future energy scenarios, you'll find us. So that's a bit about scenarios. I'll get on to modelling demand, so how we do it. Critically, even though we're called the electricity system operator, we model demand. We do the demand forecasting for our gas network and our electricity network. That means both of those networks are designed based on a common set of forecasts. It also means we can look for opportunities between those two vectors, particularly electricity and hydrogen. And it's really important to us to make sure those two networks are complementary. There needs to be competition, absolutely, to find the best solution, but we also believe there's limits to that, and diminishing returns from competition. So we're trying to make sure we think about the whole energy system when we're doing our forecasting. We start at sector level, bottom up, just as they do in France, and I'm going to be talking about peaks and annuals. So when I talk about annuals, I'm talking about amount of energy, terawatt hours, and when I'm talking about peaks, I'm talking about instantaneous power. So we start with historic demand from a number of well-corrected sources, and then we split those into sectors using established ratios. So we've got established ratios for different sectors, so industry, commerce, transport, and like residential sectors. And that gives us the sort of historical annual demand. We work out peak demand using an annual to peak ratio, and we get that from live data from 2,000 homes. 2,000 because that's statistically representative of the population in Britain, and we can see half-hourly metered data, so that we have a good understanding of where peaks are in the country. We then start up forecasts from about 60 different models. So individual heat appliances, industrial, commerce, flexibility, and then we'll aggregate those into an aggregation really. We have a model feed and a model heat transport model starts what peaks are directly, and then we infer the peak for industry and commerce, because that's the area we have the least amount of granular data for demand. To do all of the stuff that I've talked about here, we absolutely need diverse. We place a lot of value on qualitative research as well as quantitative research, but we speak to a lot of people. We speak to something in the region of about 500 stakeholders for our first publication. And for the stuff that I'm talking about in here, there's been 26 separate engagement sessions with groups of people. We use diverse sets. We all make sure that, we're looking for people who disagree with each other and disagree with us as well. And we're looking for a range of views, and we test them regularly with each other. We have a rigorous process of peer review within the company, but we also test that with the government, and we test that with our stakeholders. We really want to invite that challenge. And we do that at the start of our modelling year, but also partway through. And the people that we're engaging with are themselves diverse. So the pie chart at the bottom just shows different groups of stakeholders that we engage with. And we put all of that sort of learning, all that qualitative learning into what we call levers. You don't need to be able to read this necessarily, but what we're doing here is we think about we think about the relationship between all variables and what the output demand is. With all of those variables in rows, and we're able to weight them a little bit as well, and then we work out what's happening in each scenario for that lever. So retail prices, for example, they might, in a falling short scenario, we assume that retail prices for energy are fairly low. In the leading the way scenario, we assume the retail prices are fairly high, and that lets us stretch the credible range extremes, not just for the two scenarios that I talked about at the beginning, but for roughly sort of 60 levers for demand. And so once we've got those levers, we can put them into our models, and we get our sector demands across these sectors. Industry is very interesting. We've got a feedback loop between demand forecasting and supply forecasting because of hydrogen production. So there's an industrial electricity demand for electrolysis, green hydrogen production, and there's an industrial gas demand for blue hydrogen, for methane reformation. And roughly speaking, this is the kind of accuracy we're able to, we're targeted to forecast to. So our regulators challenge us to provide them a 4-year ahead forecast, which is 4% out, and a 1-year ahead forecast, which is within 2% accuracy. And this year we were able to beat those quite significantly. And if you consider the kind of year the whole world has, that's something we're really proud of. Things have been particularly chaotic in Britain compared to the rest of the world. In about October, November over here, while everybody was struggling with an affordability crisis, we had a new budget that introduced a lot of uncertainty to sort of price forecasts in Britain. So over the past sort of 8-9 months, the whole world has been experiencing uncertainty and volatility. We've managed to, that's been compounded in Britain, but we've managed to forecast through it. And so here's our sort of our main insights really. So that affordability crisis does suppress demand in the near term. These, as I said, I'm talking about last year's numbers here, but between now and 2026, we were predicting demands to be fairly flat. We're now forecasting between 10 and 20 sort of terawatt hours of price elasticity, and we've seen that. So we've seen demands, historically measured demands, come through lower than we'd forecast last year. After 2026, electrification overtakes prices as a lever, and just the rapid electrification, particularly in leading the way in consumer transformation, sees demands rise quite significantly. What's interesting about these two graphs, this is a graph about annual demand, so the total amount of electricity we use over the course of the year. We see a good level of price elasticity in annual demand, but we see it less in peak demand, where consumers are less likely to reduce their demand because they're protecting the demand that matters most to them. So yeah, peak demand doesn't drop as far as annual demand does in our forecast for next year. And for leading the way, we were forecasting this green line. So we were forecasting a drop in peak demand. We've actually seen a lower than expected efficiency uptake because of that affordability crisis. So that's the main change in peak demand. So we're actually expecting a narrower scenario range than we were last year. And the difference in these scenarios is mainly down to different assumptions for flexibility, efficiency, and general electrification. And you know, this should be surprising. So peak electricity demand does still rise in all scenarios as more of the economy is electrified. But even that, this is peak demand based on a measure we call ACS, so average cold spell. And this is about peak demand using a very traditional definition of peak, you know, where we're talking about cold, dark spells where people have their heating on, where people have their lighting on. You know, we'll talk about those sorts of peaks when people get home in the day, where peaks are essentially very demand driven. We're still going to see that sort of consumer behavior, but that's not necessarily when the system is going to be most stressed. Most stress occurs when the delta between available supply and demand is greatest. So we're going to fundamentally need to rethink how we define peak demand, and I think that's a challenge for all of us around the world. So I'll get into my last few slides are about you know, actual insights to give you a flavour of the kind of things that we can work out. So we know that end consumer demand reduces significantly as we decarbonise. At the beginning of this presentation, I showed you some energy flow diagrams, and yeah, the makeup of that energy flow changes, but it also generally reduces between now and 2050. And on here you can see the stack between different sectors. The sector split doesn't change too much, but we see transport demand going down significantly. The fuel people use will change significantly. A really interesting thing to point out on this slide is this bar here, sort of third in from the left. This is our high hydrogen scenario, system transformation. This is our scenario for reaching net zero by 2050 using what we think is the credible highest amount of hydrogen in the economy, including hydrogen for heating. Even in that scenario, we have a doubling of electricity demand. So we can't get away from increased electrification. But we can do something about it through flex. So this is I'm not going to go through all the columns here, but essentially we can, through a number of different levers, we can in leading the way by 2050, we can get demand down, peak demand to about 70 gigawatts from 120. If we didn't manage it at all, it would be about 120 gigawatts because of the amount of electrification. If we can get people to engage in flexibility, we can get that down to about 70, which is similar to the kind of levels we see today. Today we're about sort of almost 60. And here you can see how flexibility works between different technologies. So the dark line, the dark area is hourly dispatch profile for air source heat pumps, and the lighter shaded area is what peak demands would look like for hydrogen boilers. We've normalized this for heat demand rather than electricity and gas. And you can see we're able to flatten out heat pumps easier than we are if demand was gas-based, was hydrogen-based. And then you can see that in transport as well. So if you're electrifying demand, you can also flex demand a lot easier. The dotted line at the top is unmanaged EV charging demand. The shaded line is what happens when we get people to engage in smart charging, and that's a 20 gigawatt drop. so it goes from 20 gigawatts down to 7 gigawatts, 13 gigawatt drop. We can actually, when we get people to engage with vehicle to grid, it can actually be a great source of like input flexibility to the grid. Got people charged, got a whole distributed network of batteries that can provide flexibility to the grid. And this sort of flexibility isn't just a pipe dream. We are doing it already. So last winter, the ESO launched the demand flexibility service, letting consumers engage in flex and letting them save money off their bills. In collaboration with a number of energy suppliers in the UK, and that cut our electricity use by 3.3 gigawatt hours. And we've got about 1.6 million homes engaged in that trial. We're planning to make that bigger next year and then make it a part of our normal arsenal of flexibility and methods to meet demand. So these are our main messages again. We publish scenarios. Flexibility helps smooth out peaks. The way we define system stress is going to need to change as we have a more renewable generation fleet. I've talked a lot about transport. We're fairly good on transport. There's a lot of challenges around infrastructure and charging, but in this country we've got a ban, and all around the world really, we've got bans on ICE vehicles. So there's a clear end in sight. There's a clear signal for manufacturers to start investing in electric vehicles. There's clear signals for consumers, albeit there are challenges for consumers as well. But where we're far less certain is decarbonisation of heat and industrial flexibility. And uncertainty leads to cost, it leads to anxiety, it can also lead to lack of trust as well. So these are real priorities for us as a country and hopefully as a global industry as well. This one we're launching again. If you want to know more, come and join us. I believe it's on YouTube, so you'll be able to get a number of our publications through any of these links if you want to learn more. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sagar. Our next speaker is Anupam Thatte, and he's a senior engineer in the R&D department at the Midwestern Independent System Operator. So thank you. Let's get you up. Oh, yeah.
Put it about, near your first button there or on the side, that'll work. And it's on. Yep. Yeah, thank you. All right. Good morning. So yeah, my name is Anupam Thatte. I'm a senior engineer in the R&D team at MISO. So today's talk is going to be about MISO's view of electrification in our footprint and how that contributes to future scenarios. I'll be talking about this initiative, the report called the MISO Futures, and this and other related projects and initiatives. Today's talk is really product of multiple teams, the work of multiple teams, connected together. So it's not just the R&D team, there are many other teams working simultaneously on the planning and forecasting fronts. So MISO, like many other grid operators, is facing the energy transition. The scale and scope, pace of change has increased greatly over the past few years. And this is leading us to, make several changes in how we plan for the future. MISO is the grid operator. We are not an integrated resource planner. And so our role really is to facilitate and support our member utilities in their planning, and also to help policymakers understand what the future looks like. And one of the tools that we have come up with is what we call the futures report. This really creates a shared understanding of across the whole footprint of what the future looks like. And then this, the data and the results of this are then fed into several other planning efforts, which I'll just mention during the rest of this presentation. And MISO will continue to monitor, continue to update this futures report over the coming years, and continue to refine our analysis as we learn more and as the system continues to change. So here are some key facts about our system. I won't go into the numbers there. On the left is a figure about that shows the our footprint. Two things to see there is, one is just the geography. We cover the whole of this mid-continent region, starting from Louisiana in the south, going all the way up to Manitoba in Canada, and covering also 15 states in the US. The other point there is, if you look at the pie chart in the left corner, you can see there the capacity, generation capacity now is very heavily weighted towards gas now, and also coal. About a decade ago, this was predominantly coal. So that's one of the changes that we have seen over the past decade, and changes are of course continuing. We have seen a lot of retirements of coal and other fossil fuel, but also primarily coal over the past decade. There's been a large increase in renewable capacity. As of the end of 2022, we had registered wind capacity of about 30 gigawatts. And also over the past few years, solar has come into the picture quite rapidly. Again, as of the end of 2022, about 4.5 gigs of solar photovoltaic. Some of the other things that we are seeing are many cities, many states have, and also member utilities have, aggressive decarbonization goals or aggressive clean energy goals. And that's also driving the pace of the energy transition. Few more things to think about are that as we see this increase in renewables, more of our fleet is going to become weather dependent. This also ties into the fact that we also seen more frequent extreme weather events. And so now, the uncertainty in operations is also increasing. And so we are having a lot of challenges in managing that. And then the last point is about increased electrification, which I'll talk about a little bit later. On the right is a picture of our generation interconnection queue. As you can see, kind of gives you a snapshot of what the future might look like. Of course, as AG from ERCOT had mentioned, typically not all of these things get built out. But let's say even if a fourth of this gets built out, so you're talking about about 126 gigs of solar in the queue, solar PV. So even if a quarter of that is built, that's quite a substantial change in our generation capacity mix. So you can see there, we've listed some of the goal announcements over the past few years from our member utilities. There are also cities which have put out clean energy or renewable or decarbonization goals, and some of them have quite aggressive plans like net zero by 2050. And so we take into consideration all of these when we do this futures report exercise. And so we make sure that we can meet the emissions goals of our members during this planning exercise. In order to deal with this energy transition, MISO is working simultaneously across multiple areas. It spans planning to operations. So the first is the market rate definition. So this is really talking about mostly about our energy markets, but also capacity markets. More recently, whatever changes we need to make to our market constructs in order to accommodate this change. Then there are also system enhancements. We have a major project ongoing to put in place our next generation market engine, which will be modular. It'll be, much more performant, can take in, given, how many more resources we are expecting. We still want to be able to solve that market and clear the market in about the same time. So we really need a new system for that. In terms of operations of the future, we are doing a lot of things. We are putting in new operator tools, visualization. We are looking into things like probabilistic forecasting. A lot of work is going on there, operator training, number of initiatives. And then the final piece there is transmission evolution, which is, again, looking at transmission planning. And the futures report is kind of one of the key initiatives that feeds into this transmission evolution. And all of these four are kind of the pillars of our reliability imperative, which is a challenge, to make sure that we keep the lights on, no matter what changes happen in the system. So this here is the futures, a view of like the futures report, shows you a snapshot. So this is our initial report, which we had put out in 2021. It shows 3 future scenarios with different assumptions on load growth, and many of the other assumptions also vary, like in terms of addition of new capacity, retirements, peak load driven by different electrification assumptions, how much of the emissions targets will be able to meet, and so on. And you can see there, ranging from future 1 to future 3, you can see like they get more aggressive as you move from future 1 to future 3. And so then these futures are then used to plug into various planning initiatives and also various analysis. I won't be able to go into all of these. We have our long range transmission planning. So that's we have the transmission expansion, MTEP work. And then the last piece there, which I'll expand upon a little bit, is the regional resource assessment. So in terms of how we looked at the electrification, we sought out help from some experts in this field. One is the Applied Energy Group, and the second is Berkeley National Lab. And so both of these organizations helped us to identify estimates of the market potential of electrification of various technologies, things like water heaters, electric vehicles, various industrial processes. Number of assumptions were considered upon depending on how mature we think these technologies will become, and also we got detailed numbers for our different zones. So in MISO we have 10 zones, LRZs, and so within those we got zone by zone numbers, so we can kind of understand what's happening at that zonal level. And so you can see kind of the projections going out over the next 20 years in these two figures. So one of the kind of key insights here is we can see depending on the future, we can see the renewable penetration levels range from about 26% to 46%. But one of the studies that we had done a few years back, the Renewable Integration Impact Assessment, the RIA study indicated that we're going to have some challenges as we cross this 30% penetration level for renewables. So somewhere between 30% and 40%, we're going to see a lot of challenges in terms of curtailments, having to deal with regional transfers, and also potentially things like in some local areas, voltage stability issues due to the weak grid when you have a lot of inverter-based resources. That's one of the challenges that you might face. So that's kind of something to be concerned about. So coming back to the MISO futures, that was kind of 2 years ago, and now that's a little bit out of date. And so MISO has been working to update all of those projections. And just a few months ago in April, we released a revised version of the Future 2. We are currently working on revised versions of Future 1 and Future 3, which we hope will be released sometime later this year. But one of the key points here is we are seeing a significant increase in both the retirements, but also in the new addition of renewables. You can see the bar chart over there. If you look at the future 2A additions, we are seeing a lot of solar and a lot of wind coming in. And this is, this is kind of informed by, a lot of it is informed by our members' feedback, because this is part of a collaborative process with our members. So that's kind of, something interesting to note, just the scale and scope of the change we are expecting. So this is a table listing kind of, number of studies that MISO has done in the recent past. I won't be able to go into all of them, but the links are there. I would suggest that folks look at that. And if people have questions, please send us in the questions. We are happy to respond. The one that I will mention is this regional resource assessment. So this is MISO's effort to continually monitor the energy landscape. So as our member utilities keep evolving their plans, we want to keep understanding and refining the shared understanding, the shared picture of what's happening across the whole MISO footprint. So we started this in 2021, and again, 2022, we released a version. Currently, we're working on the next version, which we hope should be out around October, November. So just be on the lookout for that. So this is some results from the 2022 version of the RRA report. So the bars in blue are the existing resources, collectively across our footprint. The light blue are the planned resources by our members. Then the gray bar is basically, this is generation expansion modeled by MISO. So we look at how much emissions reductions or clean energy targets have been goals have been stated by our members, and we fill in the gap between the planned resources to say that, okay, it looks like we need this much more resources in order to achieve those emissions targets. Some few interesting things to note is if we were to just look at the existing and planned resources, we are starting to see a gap, potentially a gap emerged around, say, 2027, 2028, so about 4 or 5 years. So just kind of like a, an area of concern. Now, of course, some things to note about is if unit retirements accelerate, or if, there are delays in building these planned resources, this picture can shift, and these shortfalls or potential shortfalls might occur sooner or later. So just a caveat about this. Another interesting piece here is, so we projected out 20 years all the way to 2041, and to look at the net load picture. So we have this figure shows the average across 2 months, January and July, representative sample from winter and summer. And so the picture for winter is kind of interesting. It does seem like that net load picture, the red curve, is tending towards the duck curve made famous by Kaizo. So, that's the piece of news. Somewhere in the next 20 years, we're going to turn Midwest into California. Watch out. So yeah, that's it's not just the shape of the curve, but it's also going to be that rapid ramp rate towards the evening hours. So that's also that we're going to need that flexibility in order to deal with that challenge. Now, in terms of potential disruptors that could impact all of this, one is risk of retirements due to various policies. Now, the RRA picture that I just showed you did not include the IRA impacts, because we had kind of more or less done most of our number crunching by the time IRA's impacts really came into the picture. We were not able to pivot at the last minute and put that into our analysis, but we will start doing that going forward into our reports. So that's basically one thing. We could see accelerated retirements of fossil fuel units that could lead to some challenges. We could see more aggressive decarbonization goals from, it could be from states, it could be from cities, it could be from utilities. It could also be from, corporates. We are hearing stuff like, Google and Amazon and various other folks wanting to, move more towards the decarbonization. Then there's, of course, the pace and scale of electrification. The studies that we did for the EVs and many of also the other technologies are kind of, few years old now. Stuff like the EV growth may accelerate, given the policy support. And then there are things like stuff like data centers, crypto miners, distributed energy resources, microgrids. We have just started to, over the past, I would say year and a half, we've started to monitor these things. I think one of the challenges that we're facing is it's very difficult to get good data on pretty much all of these, but we have started to monitor this, and I think that will help us to inform various risks of how those load growth projections will change in the future. The other major risk is like the pace of the transmission system development. I think that's also something we have to monitor going forward. Then the last point there is about the new and emerging technologies, things like modular nuclear reactors, long duration storage, hydrogen-based resources. Here again, we have a challenge in modeling this because things like how do we model the parameters, how do we model the costs? There's a lot of uncertainty around this. And I think this is, we kind of have made some simplified assumptions about it. And so going back a few slides to a picture here, you can see kind of in the additions column, if I have the pointer, hopefully, never mind. So you can see we have like about projected 29 gigawatts of what we are calling this flex unit. Flex unit is kind of like an idealization and of, it could be, basically it's a very high availability unit with low emissions. So it could be a modular nuclear reactor. It could be carbon capture with sequestration. We don't really know what it is. So we've kind of, tried to do the best of both worlds approach and just assume that there'll be some technology in the future that will combine the best elements of all of these. And so projected that into the future. So yeah, coming back to this, I think this is going to be a challenge for us going forward. We'll continue to update the futures. That's going to be one of the things. We'll also continue to update the regional resource assessment. We hope that that will help our stakeholders and also policymakers understand the scale and scope of the challenge. And I think with that, I'll conclude my talk.
Thank you, Anupam. All right, our next and last talk for this part of our session is from Mark Esguerra from SCE. So take it away, Mark.
Thank you. Just confirming you could see my screen in presenter mode.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity here to share what SCE is doing around forecasting and planning. And I'm here to talk about our work that we've done just recently on our transportation electrification forecasting and planning. So we just recently filed our general rate case to seek approval for costs that we're going to incur over the next 4 years. Our rate case cycles here in California are on a 4-year basis. So every 4 years, the 3 different investor-owned utilities in California will file a general rate case. And one thing here that we were preparing for is, with the various policies for transportation electrification, is making sure our grid is ready. And over the past few general rate case cycles, our traditional planning process has met a lot of those historical needs. The load growth have been pretty modest and predictable. But with the recent surge of various decarbonization policies here around electrifying our grid, particularly in transportation electrification or TE, we were recognizing that transformation can happen much quicker. And there were gaps the way our planning processes were set up within the California utilities, because there's certain requirements of which forecast to use, that if we waited for the updated policies to be reflected in the forecast, we recognize that we may fall short, particularly for SCE, since in this year, in 2023, we were filing our general rate case, and a lot of our work was the studies were completed in 2022, where an updated forecast wasn't ready. And so effectively, we wanted to make sure that we were identifying the work and seeking approval to start moving forward with that, because we were recognizing that there was going to likely be a lot of larger scale projects like substations. Substation development is a lengthy development. There's long lead times associated with it. There's in some cases, we're going to have to look to see if we can procure land that we don't own at this moment, or even retrofitting existing substations where we have to expand the footprint. All that could take significant amount of time. And so the volume that we were expecting was going to be sizable. So we want to get ahead of that. And we were also very mindful about some of the impacts that this would have. If we weren't able to electrify, get our grid ready to meet some of these larger demands, one, there would be the impacts to some of the air quality issues that we've been dealing with here, but as well as some of the consequences around California's economy. We've heard a lot about the various supply chain shortages with materials to build, but what we didn't want to add to it is basically the grid not being ready to help serve those customers that are going to be dependent on it. And so we took this opportunity to basically undertake an analysis just focused on the growth for transportation electrification. And I know that the other day you were able to hear our colleagues from Kavala, and they have also performed their own study from an electrification impacts perspective. And I think what you'll see, there's pretty growing consensus on the type of load growth and the type of transformation that clean energy is going to provide. But there will be a significant amount of infrastructure is going to be needed. And I think you've seen this here the other day. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but Kavala was retained by the California Public Utilities Commission as a consultant to perform the electrification impact study pretty much for the state, to understand what the needs would look like for distribution out to 2035. And what we can say here is that their study findings are directionally aligned with where Southern California Edison is seeing. I think there are some specific details that we're working to better understand. There's some differences in some of the assumptions for solutions and others, but directionally it's pretty much in line. And what we're seeing here is in our state forecast, our California Energy Commission, the CEC, they're the authority that does a lot of our energy forecasting that we are to adopt. And what they're showing for transportation electrification, we're seeing a 7x growth compared to their previous report. So I believe they provide their state forecast reports, I think roughly every 2 years. And in between there's kind of a refresh version mid-year, but not an official forecast. And compared to their prior report in 2020, 2021, it was about 7 times more. And you can see that when you look at this, the graphics on the bottom, just the dollars that you're looking at. When we looked at this analysis, if we use kind of the older forecast, it was a little bit under 5 billion out to 2035. And then when you take kind of the current policies that are in place, you really see a sizable increase. Like we're looking up in the upwards into 10 billion. Now the graphic here to the right with the bar chart, that's Kavala's preliminary cost findings. I think that's indicative for the entire state of California on the distribution grid. And the different bars represent different scenarios that they looked at in terms of adoption and how transportation electrification would show up on the grid. But you can see directionally it's increasing pretty sizably. which is in line directionally with our general rate case, our proposal that we put forward to our Public Utilities Commission. So reading the grid, and what we're showing here, if you look just on the curves here, and this is the challenge that SCE had. Our planning process, in order to make our filing for 2023, a lot of our analyses pretty much had to be wrapped up in 2022. But the forecast that we were mandated to use, and this chart here is showing what the transportation electrification forecast, didn't reflect all the recent policy items that were approved that we were seeing moving really rapidly. And if you look at this chart, I think what you'll see, if you look at the green bar, that was the amount of transportation electrification that we were going to be mandated to use in the forecast that we were supposed to use for our GRC filing. And you can see it's pretty low, and there's a lot of good reasons. Policies were moving very rapidly, and I think at that point the CEC's forecast was in the process of getting updated, but wasn't going to be updated in time for when we were going to be performing this analysis as well as filing our general rate case. And so what we've done is, if you look at the gold bar, which is much higher, we've actually developed a higher forecast, which is based off of our air resources boards, sourcing strategy and different pathways, which I'll get into a little bit more in other slides. So we plan to a slightly higher number. And then there's a blue line here where there was an adopted forecast recently updated. It brings us a little closer. And we're also hearing that there's other revisions to that forecast that will bring us pretty close to the gold line. But nonetheless, for our general rate case, rather than just stick to the green line for our planning, even that's what we're mandated to, we had proposed to use a supplemental forecast that was more in line with our state policy targets, which is the gold bar. And you can see in the earlier years, from 2023 to 2025, they're probably within, but you can see the numbers really start to deviate once you get out to 10 years. And our concern was, we were worried about some of the longer lead time projects. If we weren't looking that far out and we weren't starting the planning now, we were going to fall way behind. In developing this forecast, we did use kind of enhanced customer-centric disaggregation approach, which I have in another slide to talk about. And by doing this, we call it our TE grid readiness, TEGR, this analysis. We've identified a number of projects that are needed to accommodate some of the load in the future. In addition to this analysis, we got a lot of insights. We also stress tested our grid. So not only did we use this forecast, but we also went back and looked at, what is the potential for transportation electrification adoption at certain key strategic areas. We're in the middle of looking at our maximum potential for our entire system from a feeder level, but based on the work that we did, we focused it on some areas that were really we thought were strategic locations, and we evaluated kind of the maximum potential, and then we compared it to what's the available capacity there, and did we see the need for upgrading the grid from a long lead time perspective, because that gave us some awareness if we were going to be caught if the growth were to happen really quickly. So we identified that. Nonetheless, as a result of this, we identified roughly about 20 substations that after you account for kind of the building out of the existing subs, are still likely to be constrained, and that in this GRC we're recommending various upgrades or even new substations to be able to meet some of this demand that we're going to see. And so a big part of the forecasting is understanding really where load will materialize. So we did use, as part of our general rate case process and our normal planning process in the state, there's a traditional disaggregation process on how we allocate load down from the system levels forecast down to basically down to our distribution feeders. As part of that, we also work to really understand what our customers who are likely to adopt. We've also were building our relationships with some of the larger fleet, the transportation electrification fleet operators that are in the area, and really trying to map that adoption by different customer types. And we looked at other published studies from our larger customers that were thinking about electrification. And one example here where we saw a significant amount was the Port of Long Beach. And, if you look on the graphic, Port of Long Beach is strategically located on the bottom of that map. And a lot of the goods, get brought into that port, and then they get brought in more northeast of where you see that map is, to a lot of the distribution centers there. And so it's a heavy transportation corridor, that's 710. And even going east, the 10 and the 210, which are I think parts of it's shown on that map. And you can see that the growth was really showing a lot of areas there. And then we did do a bottom-up view, looking at our large fleet operators that operate medium to heavy duty or planning to operate medium to heavy duty, and really try to understand their propensity for adoption. We also consider other data points that reflected the TE adoption, identification of where the truck stops were, location, some of where the large warehouses were, the drayage truck companies, and then, where we were hearing that there was going to be deployment of DC fast chargers, because those
Hey,
have
Mark,
significant impacts. Yes.
I'm sorry. There's a fire alarm going off in the conference room.
Oh, okay. I'll pause.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So last while I left off, I think we talked about different data points that we consider as part of our forecast. So I'll get into just a little bit more about the EV forecast comparisons, maybe some of the details and how we forecast. So I'll just jump to the next slide here. So in the forecast, as we mentioned earlier, that the state forecast we were going to be mandated to use at the time was a little under forecast at the time. It's since caught up, but in order for us to do that, the work that we've done, we break it out by the different type of vehicle type. For light duty vehicles, we performed a regression analysis to identify what the key indicators of EV adoption by using historical EV adoption and customers' demographic and socioeconomic data. In addition, we also reflected potential EV adoption from some of our low-income customers by utilizing our most recent internal customer segmentation analysis, which was captured by our own customer service database. Since then, with that, we then allocated the supplemental forecast using some of the different policy measures, particularly what our California Air Resources Board had in their mobile source strategy forecast, from our system level down to the circuit level based on relative propensity scores for all our various distribution circuits that are within our service territory. The next two, the medium and heavy duty. So if we break it out here, for medium duty, the propensity score of each circuit was calculated, by estimating each customer's potential of the customer's annual peak demand within our, from our own kind of customer service information. Then we aggregated that information up to a circuit level, and then we were able to convert those circuit values to percentages of our total SCE system. For heavy duty, the propensity score for each was calculated by using, we wanted to be able to monitor the number of fleet truck moves, and what the areas that we were focusing on is from our port of Long Beach. That's where a lot of the goods movement arrives from. So Port of Long Beach, from our San Pedro Bay Ports Clean Truck Program information, and then we aggregated that to a circuit level, and then converting those circuit level values to percentages of the total SCE system value. And then for buses, the propensity score of each customer was calculated by determining each potential customer's current number of buses. And we got that from, what was in the Federal Transit Administration's National Transit Database, and then our California Air Resource Board's Innovative Clean Transit plans. We took that and we aggregated that information to a circuit level, and then converted those percentages to be part of the total system value. And then we allocated this supplemental forecast at the SE level to the circuit based on relative propensity scores for SCE service territory. For forklifts on the forecasting, the propensity score of each circuit was calculated by taking the potential electric forklift customers' annual peak demand. Again, this is from our own internal kind of customer service information, very similar. We aggregated that information, and then at the circuit level, and then converted those percentages to what that would represent from a total system value. And then we allocate that supplemental forecast at the SCE level to circuit based on relative propensity scores for all our distribution circuits within our service territory. And then, for the other off-road, the TRUs, a transport refrigeration unit, the propensity score of each of those circuits was calculated by determining the potential of the customer's number of dock doors from our California Air Resources Board's list of facilities that have the potential for TRU. Again, similarly, we aggregated, those customer information up to the circuit and then converted those circuit values to be percentages of what it would be for the entire system. And then we allocated that back down using relative propensity score. So I'm not an expert on how we did the forecast. I have other teams, but definitely my team and I, we definitely use this information here. So basically we pull this information together and to be able to use it in our distribution system planning. As something that I know it's been discussed here, but definitely we're seeing it too, a key consideration for forecasting is the load shapes that you use in planning. I think there's a lot that we're still learning, particularly when it comes to medium to heavy duty on what the load shapes would look like. But just from the information we have, we use various load shapes across different vehicle classes. They're developed based on what available information that we have at the time. I think this is an area that we'll continue to iterate and learn from the industry on. And the load profiles here are placing charging outside of midday system peaks based on what we're seeing here, but depending on the circuit, may or may not contribute to circuit overloads. And then the graphic here on the right is that we looked at scenarios if there was a managed versus unmanaged charging. So we explored that there. To see if we had some cases that were more similar to kind of our time of use rates, and definitely we saw impacts to our cost forecast in terms of infrastructure. I know there's a lot of curves there, but the red curve is the unmanaged, and you can see it's higher than the other items, and then the managed one, if it was something that was more managed profile, which is I'd say it's the yellow curves, and you can also have kind of we have other curves there as well, but you can see that it's much lower than the red curve, and depending on where your system limitations are, it could create key overloads. So in short, we're running the grid. We're seeing that really forecasting matters. More work is going to be needed, but based on our analysis, that targeted investments are going to be needed now. And we've done kind of our work on bottoms-up analysis. Cabala's done some work that we're going to learn from them as well as others on how to improve on that. And it may be for a time, there may be multiple scenarios that we'll have to perform and figure out how we can align those. What we've seen here is based on our forecasting, about 10 to 15% of our distribution assets are being proposed where we're seeing high amounts of transportation electrification. We think that's going to change. We think now that the forecasts are getting updated and more interest is growing, we're going to see more grow. But we do have growth in some key areas, like I mentioned here, like kind of the Port of Long Beach, that based on their projections, I mean, we're seeing things that could be anywhere to 10 to 20x of what they were looking at, which would be entirely transformational, and other challenges for us to kind of build out the grid as well as how we get other supply resources. And we're seeing this today. We're using information we're getting today to inform our forecasting. One thing that we've noticed since 2021, we were tracking just the transportation electrification requests that were coming in at requesting 500 kVA or higher, half a megawatt or higher. And since 2021, we've received about 700 of those, and it's actually probably closer to 800 now when you factor in this year. And what we've seen is that when you look at it on a year over year from a request perspective, the volumes have been going up. But even more importantly, when you look at the average size of these requests, they're also increasing year over year. So I think we're expecting to see really, really high demands that's coming in, and using this information to inform our forecast of where and when, and actually working with the fleets on, do they have an indication of their profiles on how they're going to operate. It's going to be really, really helpful for us to understand, to to build out a grid. And we're also cognizant that there's, really we want to stay ahead of this or keep up with it, because there's going to be benefits to some of our vulnerable communities. Another key insight here is that, over 90% of the locations that we've identified are along a major transportation corridor, which is not a surprise. So it's giving us strong signals that we need to make sure we've got the grid ready in those areas, particularly those that are close to the ports. So once the supply comes in from the ships, that they get delivered to some of the distribution centers, and making sure that's well prepared from a grid perspective. And then that close to 70% of them are in our disadvantaged communities, and so we know that there's opportunities to help reinforce the grid in those areas, and as well as help clean the environment, including the air. So with that, I believe that's, oh no, I got one more slide here. So, in addition here, another point to add is that in addition to the forecasting and the impacts, we are taking, looking at all the work we have and trying to take an integrated approach. And the second bullet's really talking about, we have a lot of infrastructure that's forecast to be replaced from an aging perspective. And so really trying to marry that up with where we're seeing electrification. And so as we're building those work plans and we're layering in the forecast, we really want to make sure we're coming with a comprehensive solution, that we're just not replacing like for like, that we are factoring in some of the other needs. And the third bullet is, we're going to continue to see how grid modernization capabilities such as load management tools, leveraging DERs can help us with that there. And we're really looking for more partnerships along the state to help meet this, because we know we can't do it alone. It's going to be good forecasting, continued learning on the forecasting, applying those methods. It's going to require wires, it's going to require technology, load management, customer behaviors, all the above. So with that there, I'll stop there. So thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thanks everybody. So in our first session this morning, we really heard from practitioners and planners working in industry directly on scenario analysis of what the future might look like in terms of load and what that means for the grid. I really liked how Mark brought up the distribution side, kind of echoing some of the things we heard yesterday afternoon. And so now the overall theme for today, I think I failed to mention it this morning, is bringing things together, bringing it all together. And so now we're going to kind of turn back to the methods side of things. How do we do load forecasting? And I think Brian's also going to kind of expand our thinking a little. We've been talking about how a lot of different things are coming together, all these demand sectors and the grid. And I think Ryan's going to expand that into different fuels as well. So we know that when we think about total economy decarbonization, we've definitely talked about hydrogen, but that also kind of elaborates into what other kinds of fuels might we be using that are lower zero carbon, and how do those all interact with each other. And then we'll be hearing from Andy from Itron again about bringing all the sectors together and all the complexity we have to deal with, and how do we get it all straight. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan. And we'll get your slides up. Oh, open Zoom. Sorry. Oh, you got the lapel.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So thank you, Elaine. I'm going to, in this theme of what Elaine just said, bring it all together, give maybe a somewhat meandering talk about some of the things that we do at Evolved Energy Research to integrate bottom-up load forecasts and our planning tools. So I'm gonna kind of, here's a rough agenda. I'm going to talk a bit about temporal resolution and kind of talk about why that's important, and also some of the thresholds we found for kind of doing good temporal planning. I'm going to talk about sectoral coupling, and if anybody's kind of seen our work at Evolved Energy before, you'll know that that's a real theme of ours. And then finally, I'm going to talk about incorporating distribution systems in our modeling. And unfortunately, due to a flat tire and some other circumstances, I didn't hear the last section. So I'll be interested to hear what was said about distribution in that. So this is kind of as a flow diagram, an example of how we integrate our demand side scenarios into supply side modeling. So in the energy pathways model, which I mentioned yesterday, that produces our kind of bottom up load forecasts, it also accounts for other final energy types in addition to electricity. So we get, demands for pipeline gas, for gas, diesel, jet fuel, whatever final energy types in the economy, those come from energy pathways, and they're fed into another model called RIO. And RIO is a capacity expansion model, and many will be familiar with that kind of architecture for a tool. The thing that makes RIO different is the fact that it is economy wide. And as I go into the sectoral coupling kind of section, I'll talk about why I think that's important. So in there are a lot of models that approach this question of temporal resolution differently. The way that we do it in RIO is that we use day sampling. A few other kind of techniques out there. There are models of an older stripe that sometimes use duration curves. I think the main challenge with that, as we recognize, is that when you lose the chronology, if you're modeling high renewable systems, storage becomes a lot harder to integrate into the tool. This is also true if you're doing either day or period samples where the periods are too long. Again, that becomes challenging to represent both high renewable scenarios and storage. For us, what we found is that below about 750 kind of time slices a year, and we're looking at sequential hours in these day samples, we don't have great stability in the outputs of our capacity expansion work. So just as one benchmark for the group here. And finally, there are many other tools that just use 8760s for capacity expansion, which is great. At the same time, one of the things that we've recognized with certain tools like GenX that focus on that 8760 time period is it can become harder to link years together to look at investment decisions over time. And instead, a lot of models that do 8760 focus on 1 year, or they have relatively myopic kind of look ahead or planning for future years. So kind of trade-offs here in the resolution. One reason why this question of temporal resolution is so important is looking at resource adequacy. And in the comments I made yesterday, I talked about why I thought resource adequacy was perhaps understudied at this moment, and why it's so important, I think, moving forward. So there are different approaches that we've seen in models for dealing with resource adequacy, and this is primarily in these types of capacity expansion models. One of them is, you run your capacity expansion model, and then perhaps you go to a production cost model step where you simulate either more weather conditions, more years, what have you, and you look for violations, right? And then in that case, if you find a violation, you may go back in and say, we needed to add a new thermal power plant, and you do so. The disadvantage with that is that can obviously lead to some suboptimal behavior, because when you do find a violation, it's hard to understand kind of systemically what the right resource to add would have been. Obviously, adding thermal is an easy solution there, but not always the right one. There are other models, and Reeds is an example here where we kind of identify super peak time slices. And the biggest problem that we've encountered in doing this is that oftentimes in these planning models, not only are the super peak time slices, it's no longer a summer afternoon, as we've talked about, they shift around the year, but also it's net load that we really care about, not necessarily gross load, right? And so at that point, the times of greatest system stress are oftentimes when we have moderately high load, doesn't have to be the peak day, and then low renewable output. And oftentimes when that occurs, 1, 2, 3 days in a row, right? And then finally, there are kind of pre-calculated ELCC surfaces. And I think these work well for near-term modeling, but they run into challenges when you shift, the peak from the summer to the winter, right? Where a pre-computed surface, which assumes a load shape, kind of breaks down. One way around that is to have a pre-computed surface for winter months and another for summer months, right? But I think something more sophisticated needs to be done there if you're looking at changing load shapes over time in these models. So I'm going to shift gears here and talk a little bit about sector coupling. And I have a really simple kind of illustration of the differences in capacity expansion model results that come from a reference load scenario, a high electrification load scenario, and then a high electrification plus fuels or a economy-wide decarbonization scenario. So kind of the details here don't matter as much, but just know that there are kind of 3 scenarios in the next couple of slides: the clean electricity, which is just a reference case load, high electrification, and then zero carbon economy. And in each of these cases, we are shooting for a 100% clean electricity target in 2050. So if you look at electricity load, right, this is what we see, where the clean electricity case on the left, we all have seen figures that look like that. It's modest load growth through 2050. The high electrification scenarios, which we've been talking a lot about, there in the middle, and then zero carbon economy, where we've added new loads through sectoral coupling, both hydrogen electrolysis and then some other kind of sectoral coupled loads in industry. And the one I'm highlighting here are industrial boilers. The way that impacts the supply side is kind of illustrated in this example here. So first, one thing that you can see is that the percentage of delivered renewables to those loads go up, right, across each of the scenarios. With the zero carbon economy case, because you have such a high demand for residual fuels in that economy, it gives an outlet for electrolysis loads. The model builds electrolysis, and because that electrolysis becomes a flexible resource that you then can turn down during days of high load and low renewable output, right? Both our curtailment goes down and the amount of renewables as a percentage of the system goes up. The other thing is at the bottom there, you'll see gas with carbon capture, both showing up in the clean electricity and the high electrification cases. In most of our work where we look at electricity, we don't find much gas with carbon capture. Not only is this because it's outcompeted, by the renewables when you have the large flexible electrolysis loads, but the other piece of this is you're competing for somewhat limited geologic storage with other places in the economy, right? And that makes if you look narrowly just at the electricity sector and you assume all of the sequestration storage can be used for electricity, you will perhaps get a different answer than if you look economy wide, right? This is still a case in the zero carbon economy case where we have 600 million tons of sequestration annually. So by no means a low CCS case. The CCS is just happening elsewhere than power. So this is from our annual decarbonization perspective last summer, and it kind of brings some of these things together. So you'll see the electrolysis load there branching off of electricity in the Sankey diagram, going through to fuel synthesis. And the thing I want to emphasize here is it is important to have an exogenous load for electrolysis beyond simply saying our model does hydrogen and we do electrolysis and we can send that hydrogen back to the power system, right? Because that is typically the least economic use of hydrogen in these cases, right? But without that, the hydrogen load there, you're kind of unmoored when you plan such a system of knowing, you know, how much electrolysis load will there be? What are the hydrogen demands? Where are they in the country? All those, all those questions, right? Biomass is the other one that I haven't mentioned yet, which is that, the biomass that I'm showing here, which is about 10 exajoules, that represents about a 150% increase over our biomass use today, including corn ethanol. But very little of that biomass goes to the power system. And it goes either to hydrogen production, where then the captured carbon is sequestered, or it goes to make different fuels. If we run the same analysis narrowly looking at electricity, we will oftentimes see BECCS capacity show up in the electricity system as a way of offsetting residual emissions. If we just constrain, a zero emissions target for the electricity system and run that separately. So, these are just a couple examples there on kind of ways in which I think the solution in these power system planning questions change as you broaden the scope of the analysis and include more boundary conditions. The last thing here just to highlight, and this perhaps is a point of good news on the reliability front, which is this sectoral coupling that I've just talked about can improve your reliability through renewable overbuild. And I think what's interesting here, if you look at the figure on the right, you can see electrolysis load as a percentage of total load, and these are in net zero scenarios in 2050. And you'll see quite a few zones there where, a third or even a half of total load in that zone actually goes to fuels production. Looking at, Southern Great Plains, for example, really good, wind resources and connected to the rest of the country through hydrogen pipelines. Okay, so last section here, changing gears and talking about distribution systems and the way we integrate some of these into our system planning models. This is an example of a study that we did with Portland General. And they were interested in looking at, in high electrification scenarios, what is the value of distributed resources in Portland, and how do we quantify some of those benefits, and how do we quantify the contribution that deploying distributed resources either on, behind the customer meter or at the distribution feeders is going to have to the bulk power system. To approach this, we ran an economy-wide decarbonization scenario, very similar to what I just showed you. But in addition, when we have the bulk power system zone for Portland, we attach to it kind of 15 feeder archetypes, and kind of track the power flowing back and forth between each of those feeders and the bulk zone for PGE. These 15 feeder archetypes are a clustering of the 700 feeders in PGE's service territory. And we had kind of 5 customer category bins and then 3 feeder utilization bins. So I'll kind of show this here. This is just a list. I know it's going to be hard to see, but the things we clustered on were, is this primarily a residential feeder? Is it a commercial feeder? Is it an industrial feeder? And then how much residual capacity is there on the feeder? is this one where, you know, we are, so the last column there, the present day feeder utilization, and that's measured in percentage points of the nominal weak link on the feeder. So, you know, when that gets up to the kind of safety buffer in that system, they need to go in and add a new upgrade to the circuit. So we've got these 15 archetypes, and then ran the study looking at kind of different scenarios around how much DERs were adopted, and then in the capacity expansion model allowed for different resources to be kind of selected in different parts of the system. I think the detailed results here are less important than the kind of overall concept, right? But we found, some significant avoided cost potentially in the feeders that were already, close to their, triggering an upgrade. And then many of the feeders we actually found had significant headroom left, and that we could do high electrification without needing new upgrades. I'll just mention here that Portland General, because it already has a lot of electric heat, and you put in heat pumps and you replace electric resistance heating, the impacts of building electrification are less severe than when we look at this in the Northeast, where we would perhaps see a bigger difference. And this kind of shows just an example of a residential oriented feeder on a winter day, where the electrified economy scenario is there on the left, and then the consumer transformation scenario is there on the right. In this particular scenario, we were also looking at vehicle to grid, and that battery electric vehicle discharge back to the grid was able to basically flatten that load throughout the day and avoid setting new peaks. So I think look forward to any discussion. I think this is I've got one more slide. So one other application for this is we've used this type of framework doing kind of gas electric studies for a number of utilities and jurisdictions in the country, looking at, if you have high electrification or if you have high clean fuels and pipelines, what is the trade-off there? So that involves looking at this question of distribution upgrades and in as much granularity as you're able to, and then also bringing in the kind of economy-wide perspective to understand what are the feedstocks that we have, what are the competing uses, how much volume is going to be delivered through the pipelines, what are the implications for rates. So this question of kind of high electrification versus high clean fuels brings many of these kind of pieces together in one study. So thank you, and look forward to discussion here.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, up next we have Andy from Itron. Oh, and
I think I'm good. My volume okay? Cool. Start with a couple questions. Any Denver Nuggets fans? Who's your favorite player?
the Joker.
Oh, of course. I like Murray.
Oh, yeah, I know he's good.
Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Opportunity cost is high. So how many work for utility? Okay, we got a handful in here. Nice. So kind of my version of bringing it all together here, saw just really over the last 2.5 days, just some excellent panel presentations, excellent research is being conducted throughout the industry, diving into all the new technologies that are really driving changes in the future loads. And, you know, my experience is working with utilities. I began my career at First Energy in Ohio, worked with them for a couple of years, and then at San Diego Gas and Electric for a year, and then in consulting. Over the last 16, 17 years, I've worked with a myriad of utilities. And I think the challenge that utility forecasters faced is they're relatively resource constrained. So they don't have the luxury of diving into the depths that the researchers can. And so I think the quest that we want to undertake going forward is trying to take this research and embed it into the utility forecast as best that we can. So to kick things off here, I'm just gonna actually pull up my pointer. I got it. Okay, so this is the statistically adjusted end use modeling framework that Itron developed really in, I think like late 80s, early 90s. And it's kind of a hybrid approach that embeds the kind of the best characteristics of end use modeling frameworks. So pure end use approaches that look at, you know, technology level detail, perform stock accounting, and look at the rollover of the stock, saturation efficiency trends, along with econometric methods that are going to look at economic trends, price, weather. So we bring this together to try to get the best of both worlds. And currently, well, the most recent survey that we conducted was in 2016, and right now, between 60 and 65% of utilities are using this approach. So it's currently the prevailing method, but it's only as good as the data that we can put into it. So I'm just going to begin kind of breaking it down a little bit. If you look at this box in the upper left corner here, residential cooling, what we're going to do here is basically come up with an engineering estimate of our residential cooling loads. So this, of course, is going to begin with the equipment stock. So I'll just use an example of the central air conditioner. So the central air conditioner is going to have a saturation, the percentage of homes that have a central air conditioner. And then we're going to look at efficiency. And efficiency is first thought of in terms of the marginal context. So if you think of appliance purchases in a given year, we acknowledge that there's a technology spectrum. So you have the least efficient option, which is going to be defined by the federal standard. And then you have higher efficiency options above that. And you know the purchases, basically the purchase share across those options. So you take the weighted average and that gives you your marginal efficiency. Then we run the stock accounting and we convert that marginal efficiency to a stock average. So this is the way we're dealing with equipment stock. And then of course that's repeated across end uses. So in cooling, we're looking at central air conditioner, the heat pumps. We have room air conditioner as well. And then on the commercial side, cooling is just represented as one end use. But again, you have the fuel share as well as the efficiency represented through stock accounting. On the heating side, same idea, just a little bit different end use mix. You have the electric resistance furnace. We have the heat pumps and then some secondary heating as well. In the base loads, we're looking actually about, I think, 14 base load end uses in residential and roughly 8 or 9 in commercial. And then in industrial, we look at industrial by sector, looking at different intensities in terms of either output per employee or output per dollar of gross market product. So this is kind of the legacy framework that all gets rolled up and interacted with the economic effects. So this is where we're going to pull in on the residential side, real personal income. We look at household growth as well. In the commercial side, either non-manufacturing employment or perhaps dollar output gross market product there as well. And recently, we've also pulled in the Google mobility data because this influences shifts in load to varying degrees. So we'll have a different elasticity on the Google mobility data in the cooling than we would for the heating. And then finally, of course, we have to also layer in the new technologies that we've discussed over the last 2.5 days. This is the solar PV and electric vehicles that all come into the mix. So basically what we're doing is we come up with an engineering estimate of these load components, cooling, heating, other. Gen-Tech is basically the PV, and then we have the electric vehicles. So this is going to be statistically calibrated into the data. And this is, in certain cases, some of the inputs get calibrated maybe more than they should. If you're calibrating too much, it kind of suggests, well, maybe your inputs aren't quite right. And so that brings me to kind of where we get the data, right? So we're starting with the EIA data, which comes along with the spring annual energy outlook forecast that the EIA releases every year. So they have end use level information by census division. Here you see 9 census divisions represented. And some of them are, pretty well contained geographically, maybe the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic. Others are quite broad, kind of the broadest is the mountain. And so, challenge here is maybe the regional information isn't adequate. We need to make refinements to improve the inputs and calibrate into the data. So this is an area where I think hopefully we can improve going forward. But first, just talking about what we get at the back end here. This is going to be an annual end use forecast. It's going to be represented by customer class. And this is key as we start looking in the long term in terms of this is ultimately what's influencing shifts in the hourly load shape. So underneath, all this, we also have shapes that we get from NREL for res and Comstock. And we often also calibrate into, at least in aggregate, residential cooling and residential heating shapes based on the AMI data. This would be repeated by rate class. So this is a decent starting point, and I think the advantage is it's comprehensive in nature. We have all the end uses represented. We have the behavioral effects represented. So theoretically, it's comprehensive. But I think, again, as I mentioned, we need to work together to refine those inputs such that they're representative of both the current reality and now also what we expect in the future under different scenarios or probabilistic cases. So areas for improvement that, we've kind of discussed as internal team within Itron is calibrating into more localized saturation and efficiency, as well as what we call unit electric consumption. So this is basically the amount of electricity consumed by an appliance. So for example, a refrigerator. We have some data here that we can leverage from the res stock and the Comstock that NREL provides, 2018 base year. This is a good place to start. And then in addition, we do need to integrate those behavioral effects. I think some of the utilities have brought in the Google mobility data, but perhaps not all of them. And then I think there's some advancements that we can make with the economic inputs. I'll dive into that in a minute here. And then also of course, the new technologies that we want to pull in. I think one key piece that we lack is tracking the data on a daily basis. So we're going to begin with a monthly forecast, but we want to allocate that to days. And this is where you really learn as a forecaster. You're going to develop quite a bit of intuition there. This was very helpful when we would track, for example, residential loads through the pandemic. We could see how the Google mobility data affected base loads, how it affected cooling, and as well as heating loads. And then real recently, what I've noticed in the data is kind of a different type of economic shock with inflation. In the past, we're looking at, real personal income. And so there was a recession, Great Recession, 2008 rather, 2009. So that affected, small percentage of people, maybe unemployment of roughly, 8-9%. But then when we're looking at inflation, it's affecting more people are feeling the pain. And so what I've observed when I'm tracking on a daily basis is there's kind of a softer responsiveness in the winter and summer. And this kind of got me thinking of, okay, maybe we need to embed inflation in as an input. This wouldn't come to light is clearly if we're looking at just purely monthly tracking or even annual tracking. So this is an area for improvement that we need to leverage the AMI data. In terms of build, I want to commend John and Arthur really leading the way, getting deeper into the end use level segmentation. And this is where we need to go going forward. Unfortunately, not many utilities are doing that on that level, but they're going to need to, especially when we start looking at, impacts at time of peak. Particularly Arthur's had a real nice graph with looking at the coefficient of performance and then how you have that supplemental heating kicking in. What is the mix of heat pumps that have supplemental heating that's an alternative fuel versus those that are backed up by resistance? This is going to be immensely impactful when we look at the peak. And so this is where we really need to get into the NREL data and unpack the heat pumps and start looking at the relative shares of the heat pumps within those technologies so that we can build that into our long-term models. Transportation electrification as well. This really is kind of divergent, I would say, across the country. In certain areas, there's where there's rapid adoption, perhaps the processes are a little more evolved, specifically around the passenger vehicle sector. In my opinion, the fleet vehicle sector is where we really need to focus. That's really a gap. And fortunately, there's a lot of research going on in that realm. So we'll talk about that in a minute, as well as, of course, the public charging infrastructure requirements embedding there. So I'm going to dig a bit deeper into the building electrification, show what we're looking at there. And a good example case here is actually in Vermont. They had a real strong program that incentivized the adoption of the heat pumps. As you see here, it's a little bit faint, but the data really run from 2011 through 2022. And we're moving from a saturation really of 5% here, looks like around 2017, climbing up to 17% in 4 years. So this was, in terms of utilities aren't used to seeing this magnitude of a shift in the data. And this is how it plays out when we look at the system loads. So this is interesting. Of course, we have our cooling loads on the right, but really the interesting side of the scatter plot as we look to the left, we don't see the peak occurring at the extremely cold temperatures, but rather, around 30 degrees. And this, of course, is because, we see these air source heat pumps coming online, but they're backed up by alternative fuel, and perhaps the alternative fuel is kicking on a little bit earlier. So we saw peaks in November and early December. So this was interesting. Haven't seen this at the system level elsewhere just yet. I don't know, is anyone else? So Vermont was a example case here. And then this got us in, okay, can we leverage AMI data? So this is actually from a different utility, but what we were able to do is identify certain customers that had a given heating technology. So we stratified the AMI data and looked at the different shapes. So here we're looking at daily use per customer. This is the entire home, but the heating signature is very clear. So you see the resistance heat is actually pretty linear as we move through those cold temperatures. Similar trajectory on the ground source heat pump, just because they're highly efficient, they can support the heating requirement through the cold temperatures. The air source heat pumps here, and these are backed up by alternative fuels. Of course, we see that they really kind of cap out about 30 degrees, maybe a couple anomalies in here. But this is the signature that we saw on the prior slide. So this is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, of course, is digging into the NREL data. And I think looking at that in a couple different ways, we can roll up the sites as Arthur's done by the different technologies, but also there's energy use saving shapes that are now available. I haven't dug into that yet, but it's on my to-do list for sure. And I would love to I don't know, is Elena working on that? Elena present? So this is something that I think, well, to my knowledge, no one has looked at these shapes in great depth. But this is another way to look at how do you really break out that space heating piece, looking at the impacts on the insulation of the homes, the heat pumps with varying efficiencies and backups. So this is an important thing that I think we need to look at and hopefully leverage the NREL data a little bit more heavily. Moving into the passenger vehicles, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of disparate adoption across the country. This kind of looks like the political map here with, of course, the blue states, high adoption and dark green. My customer in Alabama is not real worried about EVs just yet. But it's varying. And of course, the kind of the maturity of the processes through which those are implemented also vary. And I think going forward, again, we can leverage the NREL shapes on the passenger vehicle side, as well as tempo to look at county level adoption. That's one thing I think we need to also integrate. And then on the fleet side, what we've done thus far is try to break out the fleets into various subsectors. And saw a great presentation from Jeremiah on this in terms of EPRI's looking at actually a nationwide study. My understanding in the report you said it's going to be available, is that early next year? That would be a fantastic fantastic resource that I think we need to leverage. Start looking at where these ICE fleets are going to electrify, when, how much, and what does that impact on the grid at the system level, but also these can be highly concentrated and they need to be also addressed when we look at distribution planning at the feeder level. So these are just some shapes that we had from really a California study that was conducted by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. I spelled heavy load wrong. I thought I corrected that. That should be HEAVI load. But anyway, it's a nice tool to look at, just a simple shape. It is California centric, but it's a start that you can look at a shape for these different categories. Of course, they're going to be driven heavily by the vocational schedule. So then the next step is, how do you forecast the vehicles or vehicle miles traveled at that level? Jeremiah has some good information on that we'll see coming forward. There's certain barriers to electrify. Some of these vehicle types are just better equipped to transition. So I think looking at the EPRI study, the LBNL study is a big area where we can improve going forward. And I think one other note would be, I guess, the Idaho National Labs looking into public charging sector, some good stuff there. Looking at simulating different types of public vehicle or public charging patterns. This is something that I was at a conference in Vancouver, and BC Hydro's doing a good job of that. They actually have adoption that's kind of on par with California, so they're ahead of the game. But looking at simulating some different types of vehicles going through the public charging, and they were looking at there balancing two factors. One was like basically customer satisfaction. Is the line too long where the customer is not actually going to stay in the line, they're going to leave, versus utilization. So trying to optimize there. That's another area for improvement. But I want to just conclude with kind of an idea or a thought, is that I think some of these resources are maybe easier to use than others. And perhaps we could bridge the gap through maybe training sessions. I think that would certainly be helpful with the res stock and the com stock. Arthur, you dug into it pretty in depth, and much respect, because it takes a lot of expertise and tenacity to get in there. But I think through some training sessions, we could kind of open up that resource for other utilities, and maybe with EPRI and the report, perhaps finding the right forum to share that information, and then begin to think about how customers can, or utilities can localize that. look forward to hearing your thoughts during the, the discussion.